The day after the German Grand Prix, US air traffic controllers went on strike, demanding higher salaries, increased benefits, and a shorter working week. President Reagan took a tough line, reminding them that it was illegal for federal employees to strike, and saying any who didn't return to work would be summarily fired. Just over 4,000 controllers did return, but 11,000 didn't, and the FAA tried to plug the gap by using a central control system, drafting in military support, and reducing flight numbers to 50% capacity. 2 days later, Reagan made good on his threats and fired all 11,000 strikers. While he was in a pugnacious mood, Reagan also greenlit the production of American neutron bombs, both in the form of ballistic missile warheads and in a smaller tactical version as artillery shells, which were issued to US forces in Europe between 1981 and 1992 and colloquially known as the teeny-tiny tac nuke. IBM launched their personal computer at the Waldorf Astoria Hotel in New York, a revolutionary new idea. It was designed for a regular Joe to use in the home or the office. The original model came with 16 kilobytes of RAM, which was expandable to 256, and storage was mostly on 5¼ floppy disks, though there was a capacity for a cassette tape recorder instead, all driven by the first version of what was originally dubbed QDOS, Quick and Dirty Operating System, but was rebranded as MS-DOS, Microsoft Disk Operating System. The launch of the personal computer was actually a bit of a sideline compared to IBM's core business of mainframes, but it was more regarded as a prestige project to show that they were still at the cutting edge of technology, and comparable computers were available more cheaply than the $1,595 price tag of the IBM PC, but the brand recognition of the Big Blue made IBM compatible the industry standard for personal computing very quickly. And it being mid-August, it was the height of the summer movie season. In the era before home video, Star Wars had been re-released alongside the previous year's sequel, The Empire Strikes Back, which was still in the cinemas, and both were still running, but the big hit of the summer was another Harrison Ford movie, Raiders of the Lost Ark, which would be the biggest box office draw of 1981. Superman 2 also made a lot of money, as did comedy Arthur, which followed 1979-10 in making a somewhat unlikely Hollywood star out of permanently crumpled British satirical comedian Dudley Moore. Meanwhile, Roger Moore, no relation, was back as James Bond in For Your Eyes Only, one of my personal favourites, the filmmakers apparently deciding that 1979's Moonraker had maybe been a touch silly, and this was a much more stripped-back affair. Plus, it features Carol Bouquet with a crossbow and a very young Charles Dance. What's not to love? The other British hit of the year was Chariots of Fire, a drama centred around the runners Eric Liddell and Harold Abrahams at the 1924 Olympics, and probably best remembered today for Vangelis's electronic score. And so to Austria and the beautiful foothills of the Alps in the state of Steiermark, Styria in English. The Austrian Grand Prix hadn't taken place until after World War II, and throughout the 1960s it was mostly a non-championship race on a deeply uninspiring and very bumpy track on the Hinterstoiser airfield at Zeltwig, which was and remains one of the main bases of the Austrian Air Force. The first Austrian Grand Prix in 1963 was won by Jack Brabham, and in 1964 it was added to the World Championship and won by Lorenzo Bandini, the Italian's only race win before his death at Monaco in 1967. But the circuit was unpopular, and that was it until a new purpose-built circuit was built and dedicated just north of the airfield. This new Österreichring, sometimes referred to as Zeltwig or as Spielberg, the municipality in which it stands, hosted its first race in 1969 and became a round of the World Championship in 1970. Local hero Jochen Rindt took pole that year, but dropped out after 21 laps with engine trouble, while Jackie Ickx led home a Ferrari 1-2. That would be Rindt's last start. He was killed qualifying for the next race in Italy, but would be crowned F1's only posthumous champion and Austria's first. His widow Nina presented with the trophy and becoming the first Finn to raise it, an honour I'm sure she would rather not have had. But the retirement of Niki Lauda, who never won at the Austrian Grand Prix at the end of 1979, had hit attendances hard, and with the introduction of the San Marino Grand Prix, Ferrari fans now had 2 local races to attend and no longer felt the need to cross the border en masse either, so the race's future was becoming a little uncertain. The fast, undulating circuit was certainly spectacular and had often thrown up surprise results. Joe Siffer for BRM in 1971, Vittorio Brambilla in his March in the 1975 monsoon, followed by John Watson taking the only win for the Penske team in 1976, and Alan Jones doing the same for Shadow in 1977. Jones had won again in 1979, and along with Watson and 1974 winner Carlos Reutemann, was one of 3 previous winners in the field for 1981. Last year's winner, Jean-Pierre Jabouille, was present too, of course, though not driving. He had been at the wheel of a turbo Renault last year, and La Régie were confident of repeating the feat in 1981, as their car should suit the fast track, which was narrow enough to limit overtaking too. If they could get ahead, they could probably stay there. Over at Alfa Romeo, things weren't quite as rosy. Mario Andretti was deeply unhappy, having not scored since the opening round, and the rumours that he would move to IndyCar were continuing to swirl. And the team were finding their rear tyres in particular were wearing far too quickly, so between races the team announced that they were leaving Michelin to buy Goodyear tyres, only to be reminded that they were under contract for the whole year and the team would still be on French rubber, thank you very much. And just for good measure, they also announced brand new bodywork for the 179s based on the Lotus, only to show up with the same design as previously. At Tyrrell, Uncle Ken had bought Goodyear's for Chiva's new 011 and Avon's for Alboretto's old 010, which rather annoyed the British manufacturer and its French head, Jean-François Mosnier, who felt that Avon were increasingly being seen as the poor man's suppliers. One of their former customers wasn't in Austria at all. The Fittipaldi team had no more engines available, and the Cosworth factory in Northampton was running at reduced capacity because it was August and many of the staff were on holiday, and anyway the question of how the team would pay for them was still open. Williams had different problems with their engines and had been deep in testing at Silverstone to figure out the problem. They found that the pump wasn't pulling all the fuel from the tank, so the engine was running dry when there was still fuel in there. That had hopefully been fixed, but there was still a sense of nervousness in the white and green camp, and while Alan Jones was offered the choice of 15 or 13-inch front tyres, no such option was given to the number 2 driver, the championship leader, Carlos Reutemann, which didn't improve the Argentine's disposition any. Matra had tinkered with its engine again, now offering Lafitte and Tombe 13,000 revs to play with, and unlike the Alphas, the Renaults did have new bodywork with a wider profile. Predictions of domination by Prost and Arnoux looked like a sure bet on Friday when René went fastest, and Alain was close behind in second, followed by Villeneuve, though Pironi was a long way back after pranging his own Ferrari. With 2 cars missing, competition at the back was just as high as at the front, and Eddie Cheever was only just on the grid, finding the 011 just not working with the new Goodyear tyres, and on Saturday he tried it in the spare 010 on Avon's. He wasn't able to improve, and neither was Andrea de Cesaris, who'd crashed heavily on Friday and then did it again on Saturday before he'd had a chance to set a time. A distinctly unimpressed Ron Dennis declined to offer him the spare MP4, so he had to sit out the rest of Saturday's session, while his mechanics put in 120 collective man-hours putting the thing back together again after his 17th crash of the season. At Ligier, Jabouille suggested a different tyre strategy in the hope of nicking pole. It didn't quite work, and Arnoux and Prost also improved their own times to take the front row of the grid, followed by Villeneuve, but Lafitte improved from 9th on Friday to 4th and the best non-turbo, relegating the Williams twins to row 3, Reutemann ahead of Jones. Piquet could only manage 7th after an engine failure, Pironi improved to 8th, and then there were 2 Italians sharing row 5, De Angelis struggling with the bumpy track on his stiffly sprung Lotus, and Patrese, who was just ahead of Mansell in the other Lotus. Watson was back in 12th, finding the McLaren understeering, though at least keeping his car in one piece, but at least beating the other Marlboro car of Andretti, which lined up 13th. Jean-Pierre Jarrier's arrival seemed to have really transformed Dezella, and he had another great session to qualify 14th, within 300ths of the 1978 champion in the much better funded Alfa, and 2 places and a tenth of a second ahead of Giacomelli in the other one. Between those two was Hector Ibaque, still struggling with being something of an afterthought at Brabham, and had spent most of the Saturday in the spare car to boot. Tombe couldn't quite get his Ligier working as well as Lafitte's, and not having access to the new tyre strategy, would start a rather fed-up 17th. Former March teammates Daly and Salazar were on row 10 together, the Irishman having had a very hairy moment when a tyre delaminated at speed. He held the spin, but the flapping rubber had demolished a lot of the back end of his march, and he'd have to take the start in the spare. Cheever's woes were compounded meanwhile, when not only could he not improve in the older car, but Alboreto could, and nudged him off the grid, Micheli starting 22nd, with Sura and Storr filling the back row, and the Tollmans still improving by increments but not big enough increments, though they did at least think they'd solved the cooling problem, and poor Beppe Gabbiani, thoroughly sidelined by Azella, was slowest of all once again. There was a little confusion on race morning when an official communication said the race would be 54 laps, which would have exceeded the maximum allowable 320 kilometres, so a swift correction was issued to 53 laps, and the teams redid their fuel sums, while the warm-up saw a couple of cars get a bit too warm. Villeneuve's right-hand turbo blew and he completed the session in the spare while it was fixed, and Jarier returned to the pits with smoke emitting from his DFV, which was swiftly swapped out for the one in Gabbiani's car. He wouldn't be needing it, and Salazar's ensign was getting through its oil a bit too quickly, but since they didn't have a spare engine, there wasn't much Mo Nunn could do but send him out and see how far he got. They set off for the parade lap, but only 23 cars made it back round, with Sura's Theodore suffering an ignition failure and being towed in, which was probably a relief for Mark, who discovered on getting home from Hockenheim that he'd cracked a rib in his latent untelevised shunt, and had driven the session so far in some pain. The rest lined up, Arnoux very keen not to whiff his start again and actually convert pole into a good result. But when the lights went green, it was Villeneuve who got the best start, going right when Prost went left, and once again René was left standing, comparatively speaking. Villeneuve led through the first chicane, chased by Prost, Arnoux and Lafitte, but Pironi had also got a great start and took fourth off the Ligier as they went down Flatschach. So as they finished the first lap, the top six were Villeneuve, Prost, Arnoux, Pironi, Lafitte and Reutemann, who had Piquet dancing around behind him, followed by Jones, Andretti and Rebacke, who'd come up 5 places, as Watson, Mansell, Patrese and De Cesaris had all dropped back. As they went up the hill to start lap 2, Prost pulled out and Villeneuve tried to hold his line, but slithered off and down the escape road, followed by Reutemann, who'd likewise slid sideways, avoiding Piquet, and came through the tyres instead, the two rejoining 6th and 8th, either side of Jones. Freed from behind Reutemann, Piquet now set about Lafitte, who was in turn snapping at the back of Pironi, all of which was giving Prost and Arnoux, first and second, free rein to pull away. At the end of the second lap, then, it was 4 French drivers in the lead, Prost, Arnoux, Pironi and Lafitte, followed by Piquet, Villeneuve, Jones and Reutemann. Lafitte was all over the back of Pironi, but he was making his Ferrari very wide, and Lafitte and Piquet were queued up behind him, just as Villeneuve behind them seemed to be holding up the Williams twins. That was until lap 4, when Villeneuve went sideways at the chicane again, and Jones and Reutemann both came past. All that meant, though, was that the Pironi train now had 4 cars in it, while a struggling Villeneuve was dropping back into the clutches of Patrese, and the Theodore team finally got Sura's car to fire, only for it to roll to a stop at the end of the pit lane, definitively ending his weekend. It was difficult to tell who was trying harder, Lafitte to get past Pironi or Piquet to get past Lafitte, but it was certainly entertaining stuff to watch until Piquet got past at the start of lap 6, while the cameras were watching the field stream past the pits. So now it was Piquet's turn to have at the Ferrari, but Lafitte wasn't going to let him get away with that and was still trying to get back through. By the end of that lap, Pironi was 13 seconds behind Prost already, which lent a bit of extra urgency to Piquet and Lafitte's attempts to get past. Further back, Villeneuve, struggling with his brakes, had lost 7th to Patrese, while Andretti and Rebacke were both in for tyres already. As they went up the hill again at the start of lap 8, Piquet pulled out, Lafitte had a look down the middle between them, but no dice as they went into the chicane. Another attempt next lap lost Piquet enough momentum that Lafitte could dash past into Texaco, and then next time around he did it to Pironi too, from seemingly far too far back, and Piquet followed him past as well. Whether there was something wrong with Pironi's car or he'd just lost heart a bit, Jones was soon past as well before the end of the lap, and Patrese attached himself to the back of the group. Villeneuve may have been having problems with his brakes, but it wasn't affecting his top speed, as he was clocked at 305 km an hour along the back straight, even as he fell further behind, and eventually came a cropper going off at the Bosch curve, bouncing into the barriers and coming to rest unharmed on the inside. The marshals were still trying to get it out of the way when the leaders came past, the gap from Prost back to Lafitte now 17 seconds, but the Renaults were currently in engine-preserving cruise mode, while the Ligier driver was charging. Behind him, Piquet once again lost one of his side skirts on a bump and was having to get the hang of compensating for it. And at the end of lap 15 then, Prost and Arnoux were still comfortably ahead, with Lafitte third and charging, Piquet fourth and struggling, then Jones and Reutemann, while Pironi was now leading a new train of Mansell, Patrese and Watson, who came past the arrows as they jostled for position. Tambay had been running 12th just behind the new Pironi train, only for his suspension to suddenly release to the high position used when the ground clearance was being measured, and he had to come in to get the team to reset it. Mansell was driving a great race, first fending off Watson at the Bosch Curve before going through at Texaco, clearly a difficult spot for the Ferrari, but Watson was unable to follow through as he was now battling Patrese. Once past, Mansell disappeared off up the road in pursuit of the points, and meanwhile Lafitte continued to close the gap to the Renaults, 11.2 seconds on lap 20, under 10 seconds 2 laps later. It wasn't just Jacques and his Matra V10, the Renaults were finding excessive tyre wear. This had been a problem the previous year too. Arnoux had to stop 4 times as Jabouille went on to win. Behind Lafitte, Piquet was staying in touch, but finding oversteer a bit of a problem thanks to his missing skirt. Pironi continued to lead his little train, now joined by De Angelis, who would be hoping to emulate his teammate in getting through the pack, while Salazar was also driving a great race and closing in on them. They all passed Mansell, whose engine blew on lap 24, just as Watson finally got past Pironi to go into what was now 7th. As Lafitte continued to gain on the Renaults, the gap down to under 7 seconds now, the yellow cars began lap 27, but Prost went straight on, his front left suspension having given way, so Arnoux took the lead, with a charging Lafitte still in pursuit, as his teammate Tambay rolled in to retire with engine troubles. The Pironi train lapped Derek Daly, who proved distinctly unwilling to let his old teammate Salazar through, while further up, Lafitte lapped Borgard but then had a moment and nearly lost it, but by then, lap 32, he was now only a second behind Arnoux and had him well in sight. Before much longer, he was tucked up under the Renault's rear wing, and it looked like it was only a matter of time. The pair lapped De Cesaris, Lafitte again taking a risk in going round the outside onto the dusty bit in his bid to stick with Arnoux, who'd just set a straight-line speed record of 307 km an hour down the Valvoline Straight. Bruno Giacomelli, running 17th, had a spectacular exit when his distributor blew, first sending sparks everywhere and then setting his Alfa Romeo on fire as he made a rapid exit at the pit lane entrance. Lafitte was still flying at Arnoux, with Piquet running a lonely race in 4th, then Jones and Reutemann running in formation with Watson 6th, and Pironi and De Angelis now conducting a fine off-camera battle over 7th, chased by Patrese and Salazar, the latter of whom had finally got past Daly, just in time to have the Arnoux-Lafitte battle arrive behind him, and Daly took the opportunity to unlap himself once more. Before the leaders could come through, though, Lafitte pulled that same late-braking manoeuvre at Texaco to take the lead, but now he had a whole scrum of battling cars to lap. With 13 laps to go, Lafitte picked his way through the pack with Arnoux hot on his heels, but once they were both through, Jacques put his foot down and just left René behind, and now Arnoux had to worry about Piquet approaching, though it was still a gap of 8 seconds, and with his missing skirt, Nelson couldn't make much of an impact on it. On lap 45, Salazar's fine race was run with a blown engine, as Patrese pitted with an ignition problem, and then returned to the race some minutes later, only for his engine to fairly explode as he left the pits, spinning him into retirement, a similar retirement to Storr's rather less dramatic one much earlier in the race. Watson's Cosworth was also sounding very rough with a broken exhaust, not immediately terminal, but he'd certainly be keen to get to the end. The last laps were in the end fairly uneventful, as Jacques Lafitte came home for his 5th career win and his 6th podium in 7 races, and the first win for the Talbot-Ligier-Matra setup. Arnoux was quite disappointed to have lost what looked like a surefire win, but would have to be satisfied with his first podium of the year, with Piquet likewise settling for 3rd place and 4 points, though race sponsor, Brazilian insurance firm Sul America Seguros, were presumably hoping for better. Alan Jones had to make do with 4th, with Reutemann behind him in 5th, the engine of the number 2 Williams dying as he rounded the final corner and rolling across the line, ahead of an equally sickly-sounding Watson. Reutemann had said before the race that he had resigned himself already to not finishing in the top two for the rest of the season, and the Williams' engine woes certainly seemed to be affecting him. Lafitte's win ahead of Piquet and Reutemann somewhat unexpectedly put him in the running for the championship, albeit as an outsider, but nobody seemed able to put together a winning run. Lafitte was the 7th winner in 11 races so far, so everything was possible. Niki Lauda, on co-commentary duties with his home broadcaster ORF this weekend, caught up with his former teammate Piquet as they made their way to the podium, where Lafitte was somewhat unceremoniously presented with his winner's wreath and trophy as Guy Ligier jammed a Michelin cap on his head for the photos, which is where the footage I've got ends. As Jacques Lafitte reserved special thanks and praise for his brother-in-law Jean-Pierre Jabouille, whose call-on tyres, soft on the front, hard on the back, had proved decisive. Niki Lauda left the Österreichring, meanwhile, feeling reconnected with the world of Grand Prix racing, having also spent some time at Silverstone touring the McLaren factory to see their innovative use of carbon fibre in chassis and its safety implications, a matter close to his heart. The rumour mill seemed mainly concerned with the destination of Riccardo Patrese for 1982, widely said to be headed either for Alfa to replace Andretti or as Piquet's number 2 at Brabham BMW. But there were whispers too that Lauda Air was having some cash flow problems and that he seemed to be thinking about making a return to Grand Prix racing. Whether that was true, and if so with who, was of course another matter entirely. But next up was the Dutch Grand Prix at Zandvoort, yet another track that would reward the powerful turbos if only they could finish, but where tyres could be just as vital on the abrasive sandy surface. Then Italy, Canada and Las Vegas. It was getting closer to the end and was still absolutely impossible to call.
Ich hab keine Lire und keine Papiere, sowas hat ich nicht viele. Auf einmal war's Bälle mit dem Papagale.